Regions. I'm joined today by Dr. Audrey Lobo-Pulo, who's the founder of Phoensight and a dear friend of mine. Audrey's an international specialist in public policy, civic engagement, and data technologies. Thanks for joining us, Audrey. We're so grateful for your time and wisdom in the area of technology and the future of deliberative engagements.
Thanks so much for having me, Cindy. You know, it's such a delight to be here with you today.
Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the people of the Three Rivers, whose land I'm sitting on today, and pay my respect to elders past and present and emerging. And I know you're sitting on a different land today, Audrey.
Yes, Cindy. I'm coming to you from Chatswood, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Camaragal people and their elders, past, present, and future.
Thank you. Audrey, I'd love for you to just give everyone that's here with us today a little bit more background and context to the work that you've been doing in the space of technology, democracy, and ethics.
Look, I have a real passion for that in-between space between, people, technology, and community. And, a lot of my work has been around how do we, look at technology in ways that can serve people. We've heard a lot about, the next industrial revolution and how that's going to impact people's jobs. But we've also heard a lot about how social media platforms, like more recently Facebook and Twitter, have really shifted the conversation around democracy and the integrity around democracy. And so a lot of my work has been, really looking at the conditions that are provided by these technologies and how they enable affect our relationships with each other, with our place, and with our communities.
One of the things that I was really delighted to see is that you're now an expert advisor to the World Economic Forum. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I've had the really good fortune this year of being part of the expert network, and what it is an opportunity to really connect with other people around the globe who are very much interested in progressing the future of government and understanding the role that digital will be playing in society. And one of my big interests, which we both share, is around looking at that civic participation piece and understanding how that's going to be, evolving with technology. What does it mean for our future in the way government engages with people? And so that's the next step, I think. That's going to be really exciting.
And do you see that there's much difference between what is happening in this particular space in Australia versus other parts of the world?
Oh, that's a really lovely question. I think I'm really heartened by what's happening in Victoria with the most recent bill where, there's now a mandate for local government to engage in a deliberative process with their local citizens. And what that means is that there's that genuine interest around meaningful participation and bringing about those benefits in society. And I think that emphasis is really a signal from governments to say, we want people to be a part of this process and part of the strategy in making and creating a better society.
I think it's certainly one of the first councils or one of the first local government areas in Australia that we've seen make this move, but I know others are watching it very closely. So we're certainly keen to make an impression and bring some wisdom into that space. But I feel before we sort of launch into the whole discussion around deliberative engagement, perhaps could we explore how civic engagement is different when it comes to digital?
That's been the biggest issue, particularly this year and last year with the American election. It's almost as if digital, with its scalability and connectivity, has these superpowers that governments can tap into. And yet we've found ourselves in the situation, where we've most recently had, issues with Facebook taking down pages that are connected with local government and information. And so, understanding that the technology and the attributes of technology and the design of that technology in and of itself really shapes the way we interact with each other, the way we find out about information, the quality of the information that we receive, we're in a completely different paradigm when it comes to these digital platforms. And so, the traditional town hall engagement processes that governments would use to engage with people is now sort of evolving into this digital space. And while we have, accessibility in terms of, the time that people can sort of respond, greater connectivity than we've had before, we're also bringing along a different set of conditions. So we've had a lot more misinformation that's been floating around. Governments haven't been privy to a lot of the, public debate and the policy issues because of these little echo chambers that are being created on these social media platforms. And so, we're in a completely different world in many ways. And I think what's happening right now is that, we're all having an increased awareness around the fact that this digital world is actually really different from the world that we're currently, that we've been used to dealing with. And so, we're not simply picking up the way we used to do civic engagement and mapping that onto a digital platform, because what we now have is a digital intermediary. And so how is the design of these technologies shaping the way we interact?
And that's something that you've written about, and not all digital platforms are equal, and not all digital platforms were designed for democracy at their heart. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to. And so, I had the really good fortune of working with the Canadian National Energy Regulator in 2019. And what we did was we looked at the attributes of various digital platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and there have been other movements by governments like We the People from the US, and how the features of these platforms actually shape the way people behave. So one of the examples I can give is that Facebook, with its echo chambers, tends to promote homophily, which is, the tendency for people to form groups with other people who think like them. And so what then ends up happening is you have these very isolated camps on Facebook discussing some really sensitive political issues, but the overall group don't really get a chance to mutually learn from one another. And so what we end up seeing as a result of that is that increased tension and that increased, political polarization that then creeps into our regular lives. So it's not as if our digital lives are disconnected from our regular lives. And so what we're seeing is increased political polarization. Now, when it comes to, say, Twitter, even the length of the tweet makes a difference, because the amount of information that you can put out there is somewhat constrained. And some of the research has indicated that, this decontextualization of information actually has the effect of increasing polarization on political issues again. And so where we have this, singular thread, of conversation on some really sensitive issues, what we're actually seeing is a decontextualization of that issue. And so people are becoming more polarized. And so the question now is, what are the features we need on digital platforms to have more meaningful discussions and, have conversations that are a lot more fruitful and have some of that polarization dispersed around different contexts?
So I know that's one of the things from a HiVE perspective that we've been really considering is, how do local governments and councils bring that additional conversation, and how might they bring in documentation or other points of view or voices into that conversation? And I know that's something that we had spoken about, but this is the kind of thing that you're talking about, isn't it? Is making sure that the digital platforms that governments use to have these kind of conversations, that they've thought about and that they've actually been designed with that as their intent rather than as advertising as their intent. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one has to only really look at the intention behind the design of some of these platforms, and whether or not those intentions align with what government intentions are when they're trying to put out information to the public or seek an engagement process, seek sort of strengthening that engagement process. is a different issue. So where is that alignment, and where is the gap between the messaging that government wants to put out and the perception of what people see as the messaging? And so that gap, is really widening. And the issue around, trust in government has been one where, trust in government has been steadily declining over the last few years. And how much of that is being contributed to by digital platforms is yet to be seen. But certainly, they are playing a role in that perception piece and that trust piece. So how do we think about the conditions on these platforms, such as the HiVE, so that we can bring, a better conversation, a conversation that has a lot more integrity around those issues, and people can feel that they're actually being heard.
And I suppose making sure that there's inclusion, right? I think that's the other component, is that inclusion and diversity of voices is so important, and perspectives.
That can be one of the biggest superpowers of tech, is that you don't necessarily need a sample of the population. If people have access to technology, and yes, I acknowledge that not everybody does. And so in some ways, some people are a lot more privileged than others. But given the fact that, a lot of people have access to these technologies, it provides them almost a link into government, into seeing those processes, those decision-making processes, and having access to that information and being able to have a voice, rather than having, an in-person engagement process that, may, clash with their work arrangements or their family lifestyles. So digital offers, so much more opportunity for people to have a voice.
Why do you think digital or deliberative engagement is so important in current context, with reductionism seeming to be really at the forefront of public policy communication?
So my view on this, Cindy, is, an interesting one. I think part of the problem goes to the fact that a lot of these policy decisions and the policies that we come up with, that government officials put together and develop, are highly complex. And it's because we're living in a complex world. Now, there are two schools of thought around this, and that is, many governments struggle with trying to make these decisions and bring these issues to people in a way that's easy to understand. And so as a consequence of that, one of the ways in which we've tried to do this in the past is to make that messaging simpler. But by making that messaging simpler to understand, what we're inadvertently doing is we're taking away a lot of the context around that messaging. And, it goes to what you were saying about the reductionist perspective around that. It's like, what are we taking away when we come up with a slogan or a simple political message? We're taking away a lot of that context and that learning process that comes with having to understand the various issues that come together. And so I think, deliberative processes are an opportunity for community and citizens to really go on that learning process. So it's not a quick fix where, the message has been simplified and people are expected to sort of understand that to whatever degree that they can. It's about taking people on a journey with you so that they get the facts and the evidence to better understand the issues, but also get more transparency around the decision-making that happens in that process. And so I think, the move towards a more deliberative practice not only has the potential of building trust with government, because you're part of that journey, but also, adds to the knowledge within that community and strengthens the bonds within that community. So I think, there's a lot of benefits to be gained in that process.
This is really beautiful, because it feeds directly into the question that I have about how does deliberative engagement over time build smarter and more resilient communities? And you've given us a tiny bit of an intro there, but would you mind talking to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I think, we have so much to learn from each other. And part of what makes community engagement so successful is that community has a really nuanced understanding of the place around them, the issues that, come up in their lives, and to be seen as an equal partner with government in making those decisions empowers them in a way that, again, builds on that trust. But how we do that on digital platforms is kind of tricky, again, because once again, are we creating platforms where people feel like they're being heard. One of the biggest criticisms around We the People, the platform, was that they were so swamped with responses because there was such an eagerness from community to reach into, reach out to government and voice their opinion, that government found it really tough to respond in a timely and a meaningful way. And so what then ended up happening was that, they lost part of that engagement process. And when you lose community engagement, you're not just losing a voice into government, but you're also losing an incredible pool of knowledge. But it's a mutual learning piece. So, even community misses out on the information from other members in that community. So it's not just, a government community relationship, it's an intra-community relationship as well, and that learning piece that comes along with that.
I love what you've been talking about here, which is about the journey that we're going on together for mutual learning, and to make the places that we live and work better together. And I feel like that is something really exciting from a community engagement perspective, as a community member, but also as someone that is trying to bring that robust digital engagement to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even from an economic perspective, having, as a local business owner, for example, having more information about your own community, as well as the government initiatives that are happening in that area, would allow you to, offer better services or design better products to service that area. And so I think, it's almost as if local government has an opportunity not just to engage with community, but to be a platform where, community can thrive. And so even, understanding that their role is not just that service provider role, or, engaging on decision-making role, but also as a platform to facilitate the local economy is really exciting.
Yeah, and that brings me to a couple of my last questions, which is a study by the OECD recently provided evidence that citizen participation in public decision-making delivers better policies, strengthens democracy, and builds trust. It sort of ties into a lot of what we have been just talking about and what you've said here, but there's nothing like an evidence piece to really sort of help the stakeholders and the executive get on board in many cases. Would that be your experience?
Yes, I do think that. I think, there's a lot of examples, where communities have really benefited from that engagement piece, particularly when it comes to digital. I know, some of the examples and case studies that I've seen from the HiVE, Cindy, particularly the city of Calgary, and the ability to use maps to identify, areas that may need some sort of support or services has been really exciting to see, because it's providing that level of transparency and information that people don't ordinarily have the opportunity to access. I think what's really interesting about that OECD report has been the reflection that, deliberative practices are really important. But that report also came at a time when, COVID had just hit. So it was released in June 2020, and I think, we'd just seen the world shift in a way that, really brought us into that digital space front and center. And a lot of local councils and governments have struggled with finding new ways of engaging with their communities. And digital seems to be the obvious go-to because of, the conditions around us. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty around whether or not digital engagement can be as effective as in-person engagements. But my view is that, it comes down to, are we creating the right conditions on these digital platforms? And so my personal experience has been, with Nora Bateson's work. And so she's, the president of the International Bateson Institute, where she's developed these processes called People Need People, which are online processes where, people get to explore complex issues across various different contexts. And, some of the early research that she's found is that, people are really sort of building bonds with each other and understanding really complex spaces in ways that they wouldn't have thought possible in the past. And so this brings, this gives me a lot of hope with what's possible in that digital space. And so I think, you know, it sort of goes to the point that we need to be really careful with how we design these technologies, because it is possible to create, you know, meaningful engagement. And if we have no choice, then you know, it pays to put in that effort and use a tool that can bring about those results.
I think we're definitely, even as digital providers, seeing a place for face-to-face. Like, we believe the combination of digital and face-to-face really are the future of good community engagement. And I suppose that for me is really at the heart of what we're talking about here, is not just about one or the other, but the combination of the two, and using digital for its true capabilities. And you spoke about it right at the beginning, you know, the scale, amplification and access that it provides to councils and local governments is really quite phenomenal. And what we are hearing and seeing is that's actually driving diversity and inclusion that has actually never happened in face-to-face. And so I think what we want to do is we want to take the best of what we know digital is capable of, but specifically design those human interactions and those human connections into the processes, and make sure that face-to-face is a part of that. Would that be fair to say?
That's such an important point, Cindy. And it, you know, it reminds me of a few examples that I've come across where certain cultures and some Indigenous cultures, for example, don't feel as comfortable engaging on digital platforms, and they prefer the, you know, the in-person piece in all of this. And so it is very much about finding that balance between the two. And so it's not to say that digital will be replacing that in-person experience, but it is more, you know, I guess what I'm saying is, how do we make that digital experience as, you know, pleasant and as meaningful as possible? And how does that then work together with the people piece?
Yeah, I think we also know that people piece can then be translated into digital, and that then can be amplified to the wider audience. So I think the two are always important to work hand in hand, because for many of us, we are interested in those Indigenous voices. We're interested in those hard to reach perspectives. And so we definitely want to consider those in our thinking as well. And I think that there's a place for translating that into the digital platform so that the wider audience has that insight, so that we're not in ourselves creating different echo chambers. We're making sure that, I suppose, the different mechanisms of engaging are actually meshed together.
It's such a beautiful mesh too, because what you're doing is you're providing the opportunity for people who may not be able to make, you know, a particular engagement process, or maybe to, you know, located in a different part of the world, to be part of that experience. And I think, you know, it is that sharing piece and people coming together, bringing those aesthetic pieces along, like the imagery and the music and the artwork, you know, that we can't possibly convey through just text, to add those elements to that engagement process so that people feel that they have a lot more of a richer kind of experience.
I think that's a really beautiful way to maybe ask you my final question, which is really about one of the findings from that OECD report was about the rise, or the deliberative wave that's building and growing. Would you give us your view on that? Is that your thinking and your finding? What's your view on that?
I love the deliberative wave. I think, you know, technology would take it to the next level, because part of, you know, what that report was sort of focusing on was the fact that, you know, we can, as a community, make some decisions that are there for the long term, that sort of go past that electoral cycle, and you know, as a result have more of a long-term kind of focus. I think where, you know, digital has the ability to take it up a level is that we don't need to be restricted to just the sample that you know, governments can collect as a representative sample of the community. We're just sort of opening it up to a bigger group with a lot more diversity of opinion and perspectives. And so I think, you know, while there are so many elements of that that deliberative piece that will bring the next phase of, you know, government into the picture, I think digital has the process to make it even richer and even more meaningful. And I ultimately see government moving into a role, Cindy, as almost like a government as a platform where people can come together and make collective decisions, and, you know, really understand the gaps that we don't ordinarily see in our daily lives. Or like I was saying about that, the economic cycle within community. So business can service their own community in ways that are more, productive and meaningful. That is the big opportunity in this. So I think it is that shift in role, a shift towards a more deliberative engagement, but also a shift towards government as a platform.
It's been such a fascinating conversation as always. I'm really grateful for your time. I feel I've learned something in all of that, as I usually always do. And thank you for taking the time and providing such strong wisdom, but also insights to what's happening in other parts of the world. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Cindy. Such a pleasure to be here.
To introduce our next guest, Hannah Duncan-Jones, Director of Policy and Strategy for the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions in Victoria, Australia. Hannah is an experienced public policy executive in the state and local government sector. Hannah's had over 20 years of experience in leading the development of complex strategies, plans and policies. And Hannah has worked across a range of portfolios, including planning, environment, climate change, family and children, as well as social housing. And she's delighted to have made time for us today. And thank you for being with us today, Hannah. I know that you're in the room. I just want to make sure that you've got access to a mic.
About that. Yes, and hopefully my internet will be okay. Here I am in regional Gippsland.
Just what we've been talking about at 41 megabits per second. What are some of the key challenges that we're currently facing
on I guess depending on the demographics of different councils as well. So there are challenges about people changing from a way of engaging that they're used to, whether that's town hall type meetings or having direct access to a councillor or attending meetings where there's lots and lots of opportunities to participate actively through working groups, those sorts of things, to how you transfer that into the digital environment. And there are different views in different demographic areas about, well, will this digital be enabling me to have my voice heard in the same way that I believe that I've had it heard before. So the work that we're doing is focused on organisations, and that's sort of the anecdotal story that we hear about community through the work that we do at Local Government Victoria. We're working predominantly with elected representatives, senior officers and officers across local government. So these are people who have got, who are used to using technology in order to interact. So we've set up a process of moving, we had to move a whole co-design process online in a matter of days once the COVID announcement came through last March. And we were able to do that really, really well. It was very useful to be able to have a very recognised platform in Engage Vic to be putting out the information and then utilising what other tools that we could utilise to bring people into the room, but not just bring them into the room in a big space, but how do you create small spaces? How do you utilise tools, getting people up to speed with those tools, understanding whether they're finding the tools useful, and bringing in expert facilitation to assist. So it was quite a number of challenges, but I guess that in facing those challenges, we went, well, we can't just sit still. This is a really important implementation. We've only got 2 years to do it. The pressure is on the councils. How do we make sure that the councils are able to fully participate, be as prepared as they can for implementing each requirement as it's required? How can we be as flexible as possible to enable that to occur? So that was really our focus, is about we need to be a bit brave here and be as flexible and as innovative as we can to respond to the challenge.
In some ways, did COVID play, I suppose, a transformational part from what you're saying it might have? But, what was some of the advantages of that COVID pressure that placed on that sort of digital transformation and maybe accelerated some of that experimentation that you had dreamed about?
Look, absolutely. I think it was brilliant. It allowed us to step into a space that we hadn't really thought that deeply about before, and very quickly had to think very deeply about. I had been very interested in a whole range of engagement processes, and whether those were virtual or in a person, for a long period of time. And I guess there was that general perception that people had that, but how can virtual match with the real life experience? And so we were just working through, how can you do that? How can you make it happen for people? What is the size of groups that work in conversations that actually get the work done? How do you take stuff into a conversation that happens over a period of months, but allows everybody to be in the conversation and keep track of the conversation, even if they're not necessarily in the key groups doing the work on the ground. So those working groups that we had, so really important stuff, absolutely brilliant. And what was so brilliant was we would never have been able to have this scale of engagement if we were doing things in person, because the resourcing would have been so much higher if we were to get to all of our rural and regional councils, given the distances that some of those are away from the centre in Melbourne, and how we would have been able to collaborate. And we were really keen in this process about making sure that our rural and regional councils were absolutely supported and engaged, because we understood that there was things that they were going to need that were different than what the metro councils needed. And so we needed to be having a conversation that was nuanced, and that was enabled through working virtually.
Just so fascinating to have lived and breathed that over the last year. I was really interested to know how successful the move has been from the prescriptive to the principle-based model, because it's a pretty big step, isn't it?
Look, it is a really, really big step, and it's not just a big step for councils, it's a big step for government as well. So I guess that, the process of working through that we're taking is around, this is principles-based. That means it's a continuous improvement journey. But it also means that we're not going to be giving you a template and a guide and say, if you do this, then you've acquitted the responsibilities of the Act. And that is a continual learning journey that we're working through in every conversation that we have with the sector. And so I think that, it plays out differently with different cohorts. And so we need to work as closely with the mayors and the councillors and the CEOs as we do with the officers. And so we have two streams that enable us to have those conversations, and ensure that it's not just the officers who are trying to have a conversation and push everything upwards about what this means, but we're working with their leaders so that they're getting the information as well. It is, as I said, it's about continual improvement. This will, over the term of this council, seriously change the way that councils operate, and it'll be in the sort of the 2024 mark, 2025 mark, where I can think that we'll really see really strong runs on the board about what has really changed from prescription to principles, because you're not able to just flip a coin and have everybody operate in a completely new way from day one.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really fantastic to understand. And I love this notion of experimentation and co-creation. It sort of feels like it's the theme of today, that we're all sort of going on this journey together and figuring out the way forward. Have there been a couple of key standouts at this stage of the implementation that you can point to?
So I'd really like to concentrate on the way that we kind of work together around the major centrepiece of our work that started last year, that councils will be implementing from June through to December this year, which is the Integrated Strategic Planning and Reporting Framework. So very, very big piece, difficult to conceptualise. How does all this come together? What does it mean in relation to what councils have been doing? And so because it's integrated, we really took the approach of, this isn't a conversation with your corporate planners, this is a conversation with the whole of council, because if you're working in assets, if you're working in community engagement, if you're working in health, if you're working in planning, you're all going to be having a part of an input into this integrated piece. And it needs to all flow up and down from that really important community engagement work, which will create through deliberative engagement, the council vision, the council plan, etc. So really, really complex piece. So we really worked on how we can bring those conversations together by utilising expert facilitators in co-design through virtual processes, through providing the tools for conversations to occur in small groups right across the sector, mixed groups, really, really important. So it wasn't just, HR people or comms people or planning people having a conversation. It was mixtures of different people from across councils building what it is to, if we're going to do this, how do we do it? And so building the networks, building the conversations and the relationships through the process was very much part of our focus. I think that, that's been a real highlight. It's still going, and the work that we did last year is really our kind of platform, our board to bounce off this year in terms of actually let's make sure we get to those finish lines and what are the new things that we can bring to you to help you get there. So it was about how do you collaborate effectively, how do you bring the people together, how do you get the participation even across the sector from a whole range of different either types of councils or people in councils, and how do we make sure the conversation isn't dominated by larger councils, that we've got the voices of rural councils in there. How do we actually show the talent the sector has to the sector? So, that was really important as well. And those voices from the sector have been really, really so important throughout everything we've done, but really, really important in that piece, and particularly how they were able to share their ideas and participate, and those ideas become part of the way forward. And so I think it was a really, really exciting piece that has delivered great results and will continue to deliver great results as we work through those critical dates this year.
I think, the rest of Australia is definitely watching what Victoria is doing. I know a lot of my colleagues in New South Wales are most interested. So that's something that we're really keen to hear your point of view there. But it sort of feeds into one of my next questions, which is how are some of those smaller councils faring with this really major change?
Look, it's kind of interesting because if we look at perhaps some of the progress towards key dates, there isn't necessarily a standout around small councils. It's across the board. It could be large councils as much as it could be small councils who might not have necessarily progressed as quickly as they wanted to towards a key date. We're making sure that we continue to engage and have those conversations. We continually call out that, if you need to just have that conversation to get across a particular hard issue, just call us, and they do. So it's not just the events that enable collaboration, but it's making sure you're always there to answer the phone, take the Teams call, respond to the email to make sure that people are feeling supported. So I would think that, yes, it's much harder for smaller entities who don't have 1,000 staff. Some of them only have 100 staff and may have also been dealing with other critical issues such as the bushfires of the previous summer season to this summer season. How do you bring all of that together? But it's not necessary. I think, there's a pretty equal response across the state, and it's we're not seeing that necessarily the smaller entities are doing implementation, not meeting the guidelines as quickly as others.
Really fascinating to hear that. I wondered whether you had any examples of innovation and creativity that might inspire some of the listeners here today.
Yeah, look, I guess that there's an awful lot there in relation to the implementation of the Act, but I think that one of the things that I've really enjoyed is the webinars that we bring every 6 weeks to the sector, and the willingness of sector representatives from councils large and small to step in and share their knowledge and present to the sector, take questions and answers from the sector, and really participate in this learning journey that we're all on. So it's the openness that I've appreciated of all of our partners to participate, to be part of creating this solution, and just stepping out of their council and saying, I'm here and I'm speaking because as a sector we need to step up. So I reckon that that's been that participation. It may seem simple just to accept an invite to get up and talk, but it's a big thing when you've got so much else going on, to say that I think this is so important that I want to be part of this conversation. I want to speak really broadly at webinars to all of the people in the sector and share my experiences, share my learnings, and share that vulnerability about this learning journey.
It seems that learning and sharing are really the key words that we're hearing from all of the customers that we work together, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that we can actually learn from each other and share that knowledge. And it's just so lovely to hear you talking about that it's actually happening in practice on something that is a really large scale change. I was really interested to understand and see how the new reforms are meeting some of the ambitions of improved democracy, accountability, and service delivery. Is it still too early to talk to that, or do you have any insights?
Look, I think it is really a little early because we only had the elections in October. So councils have been going through the induction of new councillors, bringing them up to speed about this big load of work that they need to do about their new roles. But I think what's been really interesting has been the results of the 2020 election. And so we had more than a 50% turnover in council wars. We went from 38% women councillors to almost 44% women councillors, so a big step forward in terms of gender. So we're beginning to look at councils that are more representative of their communities. And as councils become more representative of their communities, I would hope to see that we see that improved democracy, accountability and service delivery over this term. And we'll be really interested about how we can think about evaluating that and understanding that at a deeper level.
That's really wonderful to know, and we certainly saw the rise in the gender equality side of things. Is there a focus, Hannah, in being able to make sure that from across the community, different population groups and Indigenous people are also represented on council? Like, how important is that, and is that something that's being worked on? I know it's not an easy fix.
It's certainly not an easy fix, and to the Aboriginal representation leading up to this election, but we need to do work right across the board, multicultural, all kinds of gender, not just female gender, so LGBTQI. The Minister for Local Government and the Minister for Women recently announced the establishment of the Gender Equality Advisory Committee, who will be doing a lot of work in this space, particularly around all kinds of issues in relation to gender and cohorts in relation to gender. But there is certainly work to do coming up to the 2024 elections around representation and getting that, making sure we've got emerging communities, all of those people are being represented in the way that they're represented in their communities.
Yeah, beautiful. What advice would you provide to those that are struggling to meet their deadlines?
I think it's all about continuous improvement, and so don't expect to be perfect on day one. Principles actually ask you to continue learning, to continue developing your approach, and so what is it that you can achieve in relation to the deadline, and then what is your plan to come back and review and continue to improve on that particular piece. So not seeing this as a tick the box, because it's not prescription, it's principles. It's around thinking about, I know we can achieve this, but I know we can be better than that. So how do we continually improve over a period of time? And if you want to, the team is just always there, willing to answer questions about, well, we're thinking of this approach, and then we would come back and do that approach. What does that feel like to you? Does that seem like it's possible? All of those sorts of things. So we can be a sounding board, as well as all of the colleagues across the sector can be a sounding board in relation to approaches that you might be considering. But it's always about, don't think that it's got to be perfect. This is around how far we can get in the first instance, and how we come back and make sure that we're continually improving. How do we mature over time as a sector?
This is a pretty revolutionary way of being able to deal with your state government entity, and even some of the words that you're using. This is entrepreneurial speak and innovation speak that's coming through there. So I'm really excited to see, as you say, what 2024 and 2025 reap with all of this investment that's going in here. For people that don't know how to get help and support, Hannah, where might they go?
So look, there's a couple of places you can go to. Sharon, I think, is in the chat here and can certainly put some links in for you. But there's our EngageVic site. So that's the www.engagevic/local government in short. But if you put EngageVic and local government in your web browser, you'll find it. So lots of information there, lots of ability to join the conversation, to get in contact. You can also find contact details on our Local Government Victoria website. And there is also, if you want to subscribe, an email that goes out fortnightly called Implementation Matters that keeps everybody in the picture. But I think that Sharon's put those contacts there into the chat. So yes, the EngageVic there is there in the, and that's probably the primary one to go to.
Yes, super helpful for everyone. I know that we've had quite a few questions, Andrew, and hopefully you've been triaging those. Hannah, would it be okay for us to post some questions to you that have sort of been popping up through the session?
Absolutely.
Andrew?
The first one is just, is there any kind of document or guidance for organisations? I mean, this is specific to Victoria, but any documents or guidance on when best to engage the community and when it's actually just up to government to make a final decision?
So look, I guess that what we've done is we've worked with people about what they might want to put into their community engagement policy, recognising that there are key matters that must be undertaken through deliberative engagement. But my thinking around that policy is really clear about it is actually setting out your promise to your community at the high level before you get into any engagement. So it's going to turn around and it's going to talk about things that you might not engage on as much as the things that you will. So it's going to the website, looking at the community engagement part of the page and seeing the guidance that's there, and thinking about, if we've had a big conversation about the environment or climate change through visioning, through council plan, how much of that do we take and feed down into the next layer of conversation that means that we can say, we've had this conversation, we've deliberated with you, we've heard this, so this is our starting platform. In some instances, something could be so minor that your starting platform is all you need in order to proceed with making a decision. So it's really interesting about how councils might approach what they say in the community engagement policy. And I haven't had the opportunity to do a full analysis of those that have been adopted at this point in time, that enable them to have a really good, strong connection to community, but also get on with the job when the job needs getting on with.
And the other one is for those that are obviously from different countries, but also states across Australia. What are the key principles and concepts from the Act that they might be able to learn from?
So I think that it is the principles-based framework, and so the principles are around I'm going to fail now in terms of my own act, but so look, it's around community engagement, it's around transparency, it's good governance, and service performance, and I've missed one.
Financial management.
Financial management, excellent, thank you. And so, look, those principles, and we worked really early in the piece to say, well, what do we mean by those principles? So what is the narrative around those principles? So that it could be understanding around making some principles live that then can be taken through into each exercise. So if we look at the narrative, what does that mean? How do we then feed that through? I think that's really, really important piece of early critical thinking. I think the other really important piece is around if you're looking at this kind of transformational change, and it is transformational change for our third tier of government, then you need to work on how you expect that change to occur and think about continual improvement, think about the time frame in which the rewards of reform will be reaped, and think about the important place that community hold in these reforms, and that they need to be brought along on the journey, which is the work that councils are doing.
And I wanted to thank you so much for your time today and for your insights. They've been absolutely invaluable, and I know that our community would have benefited hearing from your perspective. And I also wanted to say a really special thank you to Sharon Redmond, who assisted in making this session possible. We're really grateful for your contribution, and I know that many people have already put into the chat how useful it was, and how much they've learned from this, and thank you for those links there. I'll just check back to see if there's any last questions.
No last questions, just a lot of thanks to Hannah for the great presentation and points of view in what is such a busy time in Victoria for community engagement.
Hannah, any closing comments from yourself?
Look, as always, I just want to thank everybody here from the sector, because the work you do is amazing, and without you, we wouldn't be able to be working to get this implementation happening. So really thank you for your hard work, your diligence in ensuring your councils are ready. It is so much appreciated, and we love working with you and ensuring that we get things over the line on time and able to support you in your journey.
Thanks so much. We look forward to talking to you perhaps in the next 6 to 9 months and hearing the next instalment. Thank you for making time for us. We're incredibly grateful.